The night in London, the execution of legitimacy. It did not begin in Tehran, not in Isfahan, not in any Iranian square filled with chanting crowds or burning barricades. The first spark ignited nearly 5,000 kilometers away, in the heart of London, in a quiet, affluent district where history rarely announces itself loudly. On that night in Knightsbridge, beneath soft yellow streetlights and behind limestone facades, a small balcony became the stage for the symbolic execution of a political era that had survived since 1979. Millions were already shouting for revolution. Cities were trembling. Civil war was no longer theoretical. Yet before the streets of Tehran overflowed, before highways were blocked and water taps ran dry, the regime lost something far more vital than territory or force. It lost legitimacy, and that legitimacy did not collapse at home. It was cut off abroad. The flag did not come down because of wind or accident. It was removed deliberately, by human hands. In its place rose the lion and sun, a symbol reaching back thousands of years, into Persian civilization, a reminder of a state before ideology hollowed it out. That moment was not merely a change of fabric. It was a sentence carried out in public, a legal symbolic execution performed in front of cameras, crowds, and a city that had long been considered the safest sanctuary of Tehran's ruling elite. The order did not come with gunfire. It came with a signal. A button was pressed in exile, and London was the first to respond. Among Iranians, there's a saying, half joke, half historical trauma: lift a cleric's beard and underneath you'll find made in UK. This is not conspiracy folklore. It is shorthand for a reality that persisted for decades. Even after the 1979 revolution, the underground arteries between Tehran and London were never fully severed. Britain remained the place where elite families sent their children to school, parked their wealth, purchased property, and maintained discreet back-channel diplomacy. London was not just a city. It was a safety valve. Until that night, the valve closed not with a press release, but with shattered glass. Windows of the Iranian diplomatic mission were smashed. Police units arrived and then withdrew. Not chaos, absence by design. In a country that perfected the protection of diplomatic inviolability over centuries, the collapse of a foreign mission on its soil cannot be explained as negligence. Under international law, protection is absolute. Yet that night, obligation was suspended. Images from the scene show no security failure. They show a controlled withdrawal. An invisible hand flipped the switch. When the lion and sun flag rose over the balcony, the streets erupted. Not only Iranians in exile, but more than 30,000 Londoners filled the surrounding avenues. The celebration was not for a protest, it was for a realization. The sanctuary was closed. The bridge was gone. There was no return path. To understand why this moment mattered so profoundly, one must step back from the street and into history. Britain's relationship with Iran has always been opaque, strategic, and deeply consequential. In 1953, London was the manipulator. In 1979, it was the cautious observer. Now, the role had changed. Britain was no longer adjusting the board. It was clearing the board, allowing the opposition's symbol to fly openly over an Iranian diplomatic building in London. Was a message that required no translation. We are finished with you. The interlocutor had changed. The bridge was not merely broken, it was demolished. The shockwave did not stop in London. It crossed the channel within hours. Berlin followed. This time, the message arrived not as imagery, but as legal language. A statement from Germany's foreign ministry stripped the Tehran regime of the one thing no state can survive without: international legitimacy. This was not moral condemnation. It was juridical death. Loss of legitimacy opens the door to suspended treaties, withdrawn ambassadors, and most critically, recognition of an alternative representative of the people. For the first time, the Western Bloc acted in synchronized precision. This was not piecemeal pressure. This was a system switch. The signal from Berlin triggered a cascade across Europe. Milan's skyline lit up in defiance as massive digital billboards purchased, seized, or hacked displayed the lion and sun. The regime's monopoly over visual authority collapsed in the heart of Europe. Stockholm followed. Paris followed. Toronto followed. Across continents, the Iranian diaspora moved not as scattered refugees, but as a disciplined body. A nation that had lived in exile for 47 years began acting like one preparing to return. Even in Australia, chance thought buried by history echoed once more. This was not spontaneous anger. It was coordination, a calculated pressure campaign aimed at forcing host governments to expel regime representatives. London and Berlin had opened the door. Others stepped through. The consequences extended far beyond symbolism. Once diplomatic shields vanished, financial arteries were exposed. Front companies used for sanctions evasion and covert financing lost their protection. Assets long viewed as emergency reserves, homes, accounts. Real estate shifted from sanctuary to liability. In Tehran's closed rooms, fear no longer centered on protests. It crystallized into whispered questions. Will my house in London be frozen? When the pie shrinks, wolves turn on each other. That process began immediately. The most devastating impact struck the regime's backbone, the force that functioned simultaneously as military, intelligence apparatus, and economic empire. When cash flow evaporated, discipline collapsed. Ghost battalions, units that existed only on paper to siphon salaries, were exposed. Lower-ranking officers, unpaid for months, confronted a new reality. Why protect a flag that had already fallen in London? Loyalty gave way to survival. Documents became currency. Intelligence became an escape route. A state cannot defend itself when its institutions cannibalize one another. Economic sovereignty dissolved necks. Currency collapsed. Banking froze. Tehran's Grand Bazaar shut its doors not merely as protest, but as declaration. A parallel financial system activated. Funding strikes and resistance through networks older than the modern state. The same bazaar that bankrolled the 1979 revolution now financed its dismantling. On the streets of Tehran, the situation surpassed protest. It became system failure. No water, no money, no authority. When hundreds of thousands gathered and numbers multiplied into the millions, the fear threshold disappeared. At that point, no police force, no guard unit could hold. Foreign allies quietly withdrew. Pragmatism prevailed. No power invests in a state that cannot guarantee stability or production. Strategic isolation reached its coldest form. The night in London was not an incident. It was the opening act, a legitimacy execution carried out in the very city that once protected it. The door was shut. The bridge was gone. And when the glass shattered under Knightsbridge lights, the question ceased to be if only when. The fall had begun. Europe pulls the plug, diplomatic collapse and legal death. Once the switch was flipped in London, the collapse of diplomatic legitimacy did not unfold slowly. It accelerated. What followed was not chaos, but coordination. Not outrage, but procedure. Europe did not shout. It documented, formalized, and terminated. Germany moved next. And when Berlin speaks in the language of international law, it does so with intent. The statement that emerged from the foreign ministry was short, deliberate, and devastating. The governing authority in Tehran no longer possessed legitimacy. In legal terms, this was not commentary. It was reclassification. A state without legitimacy is no longer a partner. It is a subject. That single determination unlocked mechanisms that had been dormant for decades. Treaties signed under the presumption of lawful authority could now be suspended. Diplomatic credentials could be questioned. Representation could be reassigned. For the first time since 1979, the architecture of recognition itself began to shift. This was not an emotional reaction to protests or violence. It was the conclusion of a forensic assessment. Europe had watched the regime fail to control its territory, collapse economically, and turn its security services inward. A government unable to guarantee water, currency, or basic order cannot claim sovereign function. And when function disappears, legitimacy follows. The effect rippled outward immediately. Embassies across Europe entered a legal gray zone. Host governments quietly reviewed security protocols, diplomatic protections, and immunity frameworks. Some missions remained open, but hollow. Others began operating as if on borrowed time. Behind closed doors, ministries asked the same question: who are these buildings for now? At the same time, European financial regulators began reinterpreting compliance standards. Assets once protected by diplomatic ambiguity were reclassified as potential proceeds of crime. Real estate purchases made through shell companies drew scrutiny. Accounts that had sat untouched for years were flagged. The regime's long-standing strategy of dispersing wealth across European capitals suddenly backfired. What had once been insurance became exposure. The message was unmistakable. Europe was no longer hedging. It was exiting. Public space reflected this shift almost instantly. In Italy, digital billboards in Milan displayed imagery that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. The lion and sun appeared where regime narratives once dominated. Whether bought, leased, or seized through cyber means mattered less than the signal itself. Visual sovereignty had fractured. This erosion of symbolic control was critical. Authoritarian systems survive on image discipline. When that discipline collapses abroad, it accelerates collapse at home. The regime could censor Tehran. It could not censor Europe. Protests synchronized across capitals. Stockholm, Paris, Vienna, Amsterdam. North America followed suit. Toronto and Los Angeles saw coordinated marches that mirrored those in Europe, not just in timing, but in messaging. This was not a diaspora reacting emotionally. It was a network executing a plan. For 47 years, Iranians abroad had existed as fragmented students, refugees, professionals, exiles. Now they moved as a unified political body. Their demand was precise: withdraw recognition, expel ambassadors, freeze assets. Host governments listened, not out of sympathy, but calculation. A regime without legitimacy is a liability. Maintaining diplomatic ties with such a state exposes governments to legal, reputational, and security risks. Europe chose insulation over inertia. The pressure extended beyond Europe's borders. Smaller states, particularly those balancing relations between East and West, recalibrated. Silence replaced statements. Meetings were postponed. Invitations were rescinded. The regime's calendar emptied. In Tehran, the effect was immediate and destabilizing. Diplomacy is not just representation, it is infrastructure. Embassies facilitate money movement, logistics, intelligence coordination, and crisis management. When that infrastructure erodes, systems dependent on it seize up. Front companies lost cover. Intermediaries lost protection. Couriers stopped traveling. The financial ecosystem that had allowed the regime to function under sanctions began to suffocate. Inside the elite, panic spread. Properties in London, accounts in Frankfurt, safe deposit boxes in Zurich, all had been considered untouchable. Now they were liabilities awaiting discovery. The realization triggered something far more dangerous than protest: internal betrayal. When assets are threatened, loyalty dissolves. Officials began preemptive self-preservation. Files were copied. Chains of command weakened. Information flowed sideways and downward rather than up. Ministries stopped coordinating. Each actor calculated individual survival rather than institutional defense. This is the moment authoritarian systems fear most. Externally pressured regimes can survive sanctions. Internally fractured regimes cannot survive mistrust. The security services, tasked with maintaining control, turned inward. Surveillance focused less on protesters and more on rival factions. Energy that should have gone toward stabilization was consumed by paranoia. Every phone call sounded dangerous. Every meeting felt compromised. As intelligence agencies devoured themselves, streets slipped from their grasp. Meanwhile, the economic collapse crossed a critical threshold. Currency devaluation ceased to matter when money itself lost function. Markets reverted to barter. Goods replaced cash. Trust replaced law. The state no longer controlled exchange. Tehran's Grand Bazaar, historically the regime's silent partner, made its move. Shutters closed not merely in protest, but in strategic withdrawal. Trade went underground. A parallel economy emerged, financing strikes, sustaining neighborhoods, and bypassing state systems entirely. Power migrated from institutions to society. This shift marked a point of no return. States can repress protests. They cannot repress an economy that no longer recognizes them. Geopolitically, isolation hardened. Eastern partners assessed the risk and stepped back. Energy deals stalled. Logistics contracts froze. Stability, not ideology, governs state behavior, and Iran in freefall offered neither. The regime's last option, manufactured chaos, failed. Attempts to frighten the population through controlled disorder collapsed. When communities organized themselves, neighborhood patrols formed, shops were protected, looting was contained. The public demonstrated a political maturity the regime had never anticipated. This was not anarchy, it was self-governance, and it terrified those in power. Europe had not merely withdrawn recognition, it had accelerated an internal reckoning. By cutting diplomatic oxygen, it forced the system to confront its own rot. The regime was no longer falling because of pressure from outside. It was collapsing under its own weight. What remained was the final phase, the street, the capital, and the moment when millions decide that fear no longer applies. That moment was approaching, and this time, there would be no embassy, no ally, no sanctuary left to lean on. The capital threshold, millions, return, and the end of 1979. Tehran did not explode overnight. It accumulated, district by district, crowd by crowd. The numbers crossed a threshold that history recognizes instantly. When 200,000 filled a single district, statisticians did the math. When projections expanded citywide, the scale became undeniable. By nightfall, millions were on the streets. The fear barrier, the regime's last invisible wall, collapsed. Beyond this point, no force can disperse a population. Crowd control becomes fiction. Police units retreated not because they were defeated, but because they were irrelevant. Guard formations dissolved into fragments. Some removed insignia, others simply went home. Command structures disintegrated under the weight of scale. A capital without obedience is not governed. It is surrendered. Water shortages turned protest into necessity. When taps produced air instead of water, survival unified neighborhoods faster than any slogan. Distribution centers were seized and managed locally. Logistics moved from state to society. In geopolitical terms, the vacuum was total. No ally intervened. No rescue arrived. Strategic isolation reached its endpoint. Even rumors of elite escape plans signaled not continuity, but collapse. At this moment, a figure long kept in exile moved into focus. The announcement was brief, but seismic. Preparations for return. This was not rhetoric. It was timing. Crowds responded immediately. Chants shifted from protest to direction. Orders to secure city centers transformed passive resistance into coordinated urban control. The psychological transition was complete, from opposition to replacement. International signals aligned. Demonstrations outside major Western institutions reinforced the message. Support was no longer abstract. It was procedural. Any return would not be symbolic. It would be guaranteed. What had begun with shattered glass in London now converged on Tehran. The parentheses opened in 1979 began to close. The regime did not fall from a single blow. It bled out through thousands of cuts. Each unpaid soldier, each shuttered shop, each falsified report, each broken chain of trust. The lowered flag in London was not the cause. It was the confirmation. The real collapse occurred quietly, in offices where bribes replaced duty, in barracks where loyalty expired, in markets where currency died, in intelligence rooms where everyone listened to everyone else. This was not civil war. It was liquidation. A shell built over society finally cracked, revealing a population too dynamic, too organized, and too conscious to remain contained. No matter how cold tank barrels may be, they cannot outmatch the heat of millions who no longer fear them. When the hands holding those weapons realize they are empty, history completes its cycle. As the 47-year chapter closed, the world did not witness chaos. It witnessed transformation. A nation long suppressed reasserted itself not through fragmentation, but convergence. What ended in London began again in Tehran. And this time, there was no bridge left to retreat across.